This episode is brought to you by Seventh Generation. In New York, climate pollution is not only dangerous, it's expensive. In fact, it's costing the state $27.5 billion annually. But what if, instead of neglecting communities, we invested in them? With better infrastructure, a more stable energy grid, a future-facing, well-trained labor force, and support for low to moderate income households. Tell Albany, invest $15 billion in New York's future. Now's the time. To find out more, visit seventhgeneration.com/climate.
Yo.
Dude, yes.
There he is.
Oh, dude, that's a nice fish.
That's a nice fish.
Rocking the podcasting world with the best bumper music. This is the Amazing Outdoors Podcast. You are listening to episode number 43. I am Brian Mays. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning into this episode. I want to let everybody know we are now part of the Waypoint Outdoor Collective. If you haven't yet, check out Waypoint TV. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go to your app store, download the Waypoint TV app. You can get all kinds of content besides my show there. It's really kick-ass. All hunting and fishing content. They've got other podcasts and TV shows streaming. Check it out. It's the Waypoint TV app. All right, I'm going to ask everybody, please don't skip through my ramblings here today. I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible, but I've got a number of things I got to tell you, and as this thing grows, I'm trying to keep these intros as quick as possible. They seem to grow a little bit. The number one thing I want to talk about is Patreon. We are getting there. It's launched. We've got some patrons. Thank you very much. But some of you, I'm sure, are still on the fence. And I get it. We just had to redo the family budget around here. Things are tight for a lot of people, me included. It's the first thing that we look at cutting. Okay, what subscriptions can we cut? I get it. A big thank you to Paul, Todd, and Pat for supporting the program. But moreover, this is why I structured Patreon the way I did. A lot of other podcasters are asking for $5, $10, $20, and yeah, they probably have a lot of other good things you could sign up for and get. I'm building this thing from the ground. So we'll get there. We'll get there. Due time. But I'm only asking for $5 a month. And honestly, it's getting there faster than I thought when I first started saying this. But now I think it is like $6 a gallon of gas out in California. So crazy, but it's still cheaper than a gallon of diesel around here. So what do you get with the $5 a month? You get one entry per month, our first, hopefully of many, patron-only giveaways. We will be giving away a high-end pair of hunting pants. If you haven't heard me rant and rave about them, they're the Uplnd Outfitter pants. Check them out, uplandoutfitter.com. They retail at about $180, $190. The drawing's going to be held in June. So what does that mean? Well, if you become a patron this month, March, you'll get March, April, May, June, all single entry into the hat in June. 4 entries, 4 months, supporting the show. That equates to $20 out of your pocket, and you get a chance to win $180 pants. That's a freaking good deal. So get in now, get those couple extra entries. It's a good deal. Bottom line, folks, I need 7 of you to kind of get in to hit the goal of 10 patrons for the show to really put me out too much on a limb on this giveaway. I have no problem putting money into the kitty for this one to get this thing going. I really want to build this about you guys. So help me out so I can bring better giveaways. I want to do this monthly. I'm thinking we need about 20 people to support the show to do that. I'm going to give you a little teaser. The more you support the show, the more money I have to give back to you all through these giveaways. I want to do, a few get-togethers over the course of the year. I'm thinking 2, a fishing trip and a hunting trip. We'll do a giveaway drawing. I can take a couple people. I carry everything once you get here. You figure out your license and whatnot, but, food, accommodations, all that, I'll take care of it. But, it takes money to do these things, and this is 100% going back to you, the patrons, who want to take this relationship a little bit further than just listening to the show. I didn't start Patreon to draw an income. I started it because I wanted to develop a closer relationship to the listeners of this program and ultimately have enough money to host kick-ass fishing trips and then kick-ass bird camps. That's the goal. Number 2, hats. I went out on a limb and ordered some hats. We'll see how they are when I get them. But Pat, Todd, and Paul, you already have a hat coming to you. And then anybody who joins Patreon in March, I will send you a hat. Again, $5. If you just joined for March, it's $5. You still get the 1 entry in June, and you get a hat. I'm losing money, but I love you guys. I appreciate your listenership. Get in on the deal at Patreon. Bottom line, trying to make this all a good deal. Waypoint. So you may have heard 2 ads in the front of the show. We are working and trying to get a mid-roll ad spot on the show and, just be able to take a $5 sometimes and regroup a little bit. So you may hear it, you may not. You may hear me say we're going to take a break. It may be some silence. There may be an ad. So bear with me as I kind of get Waypoint launched. Welcome to all the new listeners from Waypoint. Thank you very much. I hope you stick with us. Try to bring a bunch of new content, and we have quite a bit queued up here to release over the next couple months. So bear with us. Welcome from Waypoint, and download that Waypoint app. Uplnd Outfitters. The discount code is still valid. It's amazing. If you want to pay full price for a pair of these pants and not get a chance to win a pair of pants on the cheap, then use discount code AMAZING for 20% off. Be relentless, get a pair of these pants, and they won't hold you back. I promise you that. Check them out. If you haven't listened to episode 35, where I caught up with Jason, you missed a good exclusive deal for the listeners, but it's still a good listen. Check it out. All right, number 5, Sport Dog. If you're in the market for an e-collar, GPS, check them out. I ran the Tech 2.0 all year. I was very happy with it. I also had Clay Thompson on from Sport Dog on episode 37. Give that a listen. Lastly, I promise, it's number 6 on the list. If you have not listened to episode number 40, it's with Scott Anderson, who started Patriots of Praise. I really think you should. I also wanted to put this out there for some of you. Patriots for Praise is a small nonprofit organization. They are solely funded by good people and the grace of God. These guys are impacting lives. Scott brings in the men and women that put their life on the line for you and me, regardless of the cause. These folks spend hours late at night while you are sleeping comfortably at home, standing watch over all of us so you can have that full night's sleep. There's a cost. Instead, I don't know, I just really want to help Scott out. He's really doing something special. And instead of, really just begging you all to send him money and stuff like that, I just want to spread the good word about Scott's mission for Patriots for Praise and put the rest in God's hands, and really hope that somebody is inspired and feels compelled to bring some value to his cause and their cause, regardless of whether or not that's volunteering, or if you want to send him a check, great. But I'm not going to beg you to do that. I just want to share with you his mission because I think it's really important. Check out episode 40 with Scott Anderson. His information in the show notes for the next few episodes because, again, I want to help him out as much as I can. All right. I didn't even tell you who today's episode is with. It's with Taylor Finger of the Wisconsin DNR. He is the migratory game bird specialist. I originally got him on to talk about woodcock. We ended up talking about a bunch of different things. So one of the big things I wanted to reach out to you about as well, if there's anything that you are interested in hearing from him or any of our guests that we've had on that maybe I touched base on, we didn't dive deep enough, whatever it is, reach out to me via email, through Instagram. You know how to get a hold of me. Email's just probably the best. Put in the heading, hey, show question or topic, and let me know what you'd like to hear. I really do love the listener feedback. I've had quite a bit. It's awesome to hear from all of you. So I'd like to get some more. And if there's a topic we haven't covered or briefly touched base, or my ADD got the best of me while I had the guest on the program, let me know. Let's do a, maybe a number 50 show where the listeners give me a topic and I find a guest, or we have one of our guests back on that you really enjoyed. So let us know. This is episode 43, Taylor Finger, the Wisconsin DNR. Enjoy it, and I promise to keep these things shorter. Taylor, thank you very much for coming on the show. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I really appreciate you having me.
So we had a little bit of technical difficulties in the first attempt to make this recording work, and I think we have everything going good now. But if you could give the listeners, Taylor, a little bit, kind of maybe a second repeat on your background a little bit for me.
Absolutely, yeah. So born and raised in central Wisconsin. If you know where the Wisconsin Dells is, I live about 10, 15 miles north of the Dells. But yeah, grew up on a 160-acre family farm that we had here. Huge hunting and outdoors family. We turkey hunted, deer hunted, and between turkey hunting seasons, we'd get out and search for morel mushrooms, and again, spend as much time outside as possible during both the spring and the fall. My dad was an avid waterfowl guy, so even before I could start hunting, I was the designated decoy bag holder and hung out with the dog while Dad was out hunting. And when I was finally able enough to get out, we would spend weeks during the fall chasing birds all around the state, and then even get out to North Dakota a couple of times growing up. So it really instilled a passion in me for waterfowl. I always knew I wanted to do something with wildlife, but so when I got my bachelor's at Stevens Point, and when I was doing that, you're close to the Mead Wildlife Area, which is a huge waterfowl spot in the state, and I knew that this was something that I'd probably like to try to make a career out of. So even while I was in school, I was an intern at Minnesota DNR, banding ducks all summer long for the Minnesota DNR for 2 summers. Once I graduated Point, I went out to New Jersey and worked on a black duck and Atlantic brant research study out there with some graduate students. I came back to Wisconsin after that and worked on a blue-winged teal project here as a technician, and then decided I was heading north and moved to Canada, moved to Ontario, working on a master's degree with Long Point waterfowl. And we put satellite transmitters in lesser scaup, so it's a diving duck, and I tracked their spring migration and related it to weather patterns. And so basically I traveled across the country working on ducks, and fortunately I was able to come back to Wisconsin, and after my master's I became the assistant migratory game bird ecologist with the Wisconsin DNR, and in 2017 the main migratory game bird guy moved on, so I was able to step up and become, the guy that deals with all the ducks and geese and mourning dove and woodcock for the state of Wisconsin. And currently have a house 4 miles from the house I grew up in. So one of those cool scenarios where you get to go across the country and come back home and do exactly what you want to do.
Well, you're in a area in Wisconsin that, outside of the fact that, and you're close enough to the Dells, so you still get the lakes. I mean, yeah, you're in an area in Wisconsin where I don't know that it would be very hard pressed to come to leave and not want to come back all the time, because you've got the bluffs, you've got just an amazing different array of topography and landscape all within 30, 40 miles.
Absolutely. I mean, Aldo Leopold and San Antonio Almanac's just down the road from where I am. And like I said, you got the bluffs just to our south, and you got Castle Rock and Petenwell Lake right there. it's awesome. And then Wisconsin River going right down the middle of it.
Yeah, not too far from the Mississippi, and some of the best trout fishing in, I think, arguably the United States.
Right. Yeah, that southwest portion of the state, you can really get into some awesome trout fishing.
And just some killer solitude.
Yep. Right. My house, I live about 300 yards off the road. We're back here. I don't even hear the cars go by down the road. So we're living back in the boonies, and it's awesome.
So you mentioned you kind of got your start. Waterfall was a very big influence on you, and obviously career path, whatnot, kind of self-explanatory, I think, a little bit there. But what, you guys had 160 acres. I mean, you guys grew up deer hunting too, I'm assuming, turkey hunting.
Yeah, the 160 acres we have is up in the bluffs. So we have some spring-fed streams that go through. So we don't have a lot of water, so it was never a spot that we ever duck hunted or spent a lot of time there. But we did a lot of deer hunting and a lot of turkey hunting on that property.
That's where I got most of my introduction to the outdoors. Was we had 180 acres and similar. We had water on the property, but really never anything that was going to substantially hold any waterfowl. We had some cornfields that we'd get, migrators to come through once in a while. And I'm kind of curious later on, I if I don't bring this up, make sure to come back to the change in kind of migratory patterns that I at least I've noticed as a hunter in comparison to when I was a kid. I mean, we used to be on the edge of town there, and we'd get geese and mallards that would come in, and they just gorge themselves on the cornfield. Well, all of a sudden the development happens, and retention ponds and neighborhoods get put in, and the golf course down the road, and all of a sudden these birds don't come out to the fields anymore, really. So there's some things that have happened over in eastern Wisconsin, at least where I grew up, that due to, I think, development and availability of different water sources that weren't there 50 years ago, has brought some of those geese into a little bit safer territory in the city. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's definitely what we are seeing is animals will adjust their behavior to make sure they don't get shot.
Yeah.
So that's exactly the scenario.
I'd love to, dive into that a little bit more in a little bit later in the podcast here, because I think it's an interesting topic, and I know it's been talked about around the table hunting. So
absolutely.
When did you start with the Wisconsin DNR?
So I started in December of 2013, and so yeah, I've been with the department since then.
I know nothing about Atlantic duck species, and how long did you spend out east there, and can you give me a 30-second kind of difference in what a Midwestern duck hunter might perceive as kind of that Atlantic flyway?
Yeah, it was so I spent 10 months out in New Jersey, and we were with about 4 or 5 miles from Atlantic City. So not exactly where you would expect to see large staging congregations of waterfowl numbers, but I think that it broke out about 50% of all the Atlantic brant winter in that area, and 30 to 40% of the Atlantic flyway black ducks winter in that area. And it's one of those things where there's quite a few refuges that they have in that area, and a lot of barrier islands and stuff where those birds basically where people couldn't build buildings on. That's where the wildlife now is congregating. And so in the Atlantic flyway, black ducks are a much bigger deal than what we would see here in the Midwest that we have. But I mean, we still see the same bird. You're seeing mallards, but you do start seeing way more sea ducks. A ton of longtails, scoters, things like that out in the open ocean area. But it's just a whole different aspect where out there you have to worry about what's the tide, what's the moon phase, what's going on. Is there a strong east wind, because all of a sudden the tide's going to be way up and you can't get to where you want to be, and things that we would never have to think about. And then the way the birds, if you're an avid hunter, the birds taste completely different because they're eating things out of the ocean rather than, here eating acorns or
I was
eating.
going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Because like, I mean, I prefer saltwater fish all day long, but I don't know that would translate into ducks and
No,
waterfowl.
it doesn't. No, I mean, again, for your mallards and for black ducks, and especially for brant, their main food source is actually kind of gone by the wayside. So they normally would eat eelgrass, and brant that eat eelgrass actually taste really, really good. But in replace of that, they're eating basically seaweed or ova that's out there, and it's terrible. And your mallards they're kind of changing their diet, so they actually eat somewhat fish-based diets, like small tiny fish. So again, you would associate fish eating birds or ducks with not necessarily tasting all that great. And that's kind of the case. They're digging through the mud. They're digging through, trying to find, amphipods and trying to find little shrimp and things like that. Where we here in Wisconsin or here in the Midwest, they're eating corn or they're eating acorns or they're eating good things. So,
I would very much believe that there is a funk, taste and smell to any waterfowl that would eat seaweed. I mean, eelgrass is different. I understand some of those differences, but like, fish or, I think a cormorant, I think, is that how you pronounce them?
Yep. Cormorants.
Yeah, cormorants. And I mean, granted, they're everywhere, but their primary diet is fish. And I couldn't, you don't see anybody hunting them. I don't even know if you can legally hunt them, but, there's a reason nobody hunts them. They don't taste very good.
Yeah, that's kind of the case here for us for mergansers. The same thing, primarily fish eaters. And if a lot of people, if you shoot a merganser, it was on accident, or it was a real slow day, and you want to make some jerky for your dog. So I mean, that's usually the case.
I will say that I've taken a hooded merganser, I believe, before, and I wanted to mount it, but unfortunately, I kind of hammered it too much, I think. But I don't even know if they're legal to shoot anymore. That was.
Yep. Oh yeah.
Can you still shoot them? Okay.
Yep. You can shoot mergansers. Cormorants, no. Canada has a hunting season on cormorants, but
really?
Here in the U.S. you can't. Yeah.
What's the reasoning on that?
The reasoning for cormorants, it's a huge complaint from fishermen. That's like the biggest complaint is that cormorants are foraging on game species for fish, and they're causing problems. And then there's also they really denude islands, so they'll concentrate and congregate and have nesting areas. And it looks like a bomb goes off after about 2 or 3 years of them being on an island. Every tree dies, everything on the island dies. So in certain areas in Ontario that they're seen really, really high concentrations of cormorants, they basically come to the decision that the best way to deal with those issues is that they opened up a hunting season on them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I've spent a fair amount of time as a young man, and I still get over there once or twice a summer. But my old man has a summer house up in Door County, and we've salmon fished for years. And I personally seen an increase outside of Bailey's Harbor in the numbers over the years, over the last decade. There's all kinds of stories you hear about from captains about this or that, complaints here or there. I mean, one thing I will learn, if you allow a fisherman or a hunter to complain about something, he'll find something to complain about. So it's one of those things that it's a touchy subject depending on what community you're in.
Exactly.
One of the, I guess, just out of conversation and it coming across my mind here, one of the things I have noticed too, and I don't know if you cover management or research on these birds, but white pelicans.
Yeah, their population is exploding in the Midwest. It's been really one of those cool things to see that 20 years ago you may have seen a pelican, and now whether you're on Green Bay or Lake Michigan or even over on the Mississippi River, there you can see them just during migration, tornadoing. They're all over the place, and yeah, it's not a bird right now that, because I deal with game birds, so that would fall under the non-game folks. But as of right now, we count them in our spring and fall surveys just to continue to keep a metric and see how that population continues to grow. But yeah, it's been pretty cool to see that over the last 2 decades that population has just exploded.
I guess this comes from a little bit of an ignorance. I mean, I grew up very close to Lake Winnebago, and I'm late 30s. I don't recall ever seeing them until about a decade ago is when I noticed them. Now, I moved over to the western part of the state and over into Minnesota about a decade ago. But when I was a boy, I mean, I don't ever recall seeing one. And it was, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I was in Door County. I was like, holy cow, there's a dozen pelicans right there.
Right.
And so
yeah, it's interesting because it's cool to see now, but I can foresee the same anger, at some point in time the shine will wear off on pelicans, and the same people that were complaining about cormorants are going to think the same exact thing about pelicans because they eat as much fish as any 3 or 4 cormorants. So it's cool. Again, it's one of those ones that we didn't do anything here to, try to bring them back or do anything. They just showed up, and their population has just gone way up over the last decade.
So were they here at some point in history? Were they native to the Great Lakes?
Yeah, in history they were, but I think, again, due to...
And again, this is outside of, your specific work area. I'm just kind of curious, and it's something that kind of popped into my head through the conversation here.
No, we looked into some stuff, and I think they are really susceptible to pollution. And if you recall, our Great Lakes did not do so well back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s as it relates to some of that. So I think
even that those a little later than that too, probably.
Yeah. But it was one of those. I think by that time they were already on their way out. And as things, as the ecosystem started getting better and we were being more savvy about what we were doing, started seeing those birds show back up. And yeah, it's been great.
Well, I guess it's a decent little segue into the trumpeter swans we talked about too, because that's another one of these success stories, I guess you could say. And I believe that was a little bit more intentional than the pelicans.
Right, yeah, in 1989, so Sumner Madison, he actually still works for the DNR right now. In 1989, he flew up to Alaska, had some donors and a private jet fly him to Alaska, and we collected some trumpeter swan eggs. We raised them, I believe, at the Milwaukee Zoo and released them, and we had this program that went on for several years until we started seeing, natural reproduction in the wild. And again, took off. One of those things where we had the habitat, those birds were gone from it, but once reintroduced back to it, they have adapted quite well. And I was just looking at our numbers, and I fly the spring waterfowl survey, and our estimate for 2021 was just a hair over 11,000 here in Wisconsin. And then at the Great Lakes scale, so Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, we're likely over 35,000 birds in our region. And when you think that back in 1989 we didn't have a single bird, that's pretty awesome.
It's a very unique success story, I think, in today's wildlife management. We don't typically hear a lot about these types of success stories. At least in my circles, all I hear about is the decline in bob whites, sage grouse, and all these, native game birds. So it's really awesome to hear you basically fully reintroduce these birds and have had a successful reintroduction. And long term, I mean, is there a desire to have a hunting season on these birds? I mean, is that, and when you I mean, obviously in '89 when got a couple eggs from Alaska, that was never even a thought. But today, now you have a population, and at some point, that's going to need that overlay of control.
And again, it's one of those things we're already starting to see. We're getting complaints about swans and Canada geese and their impact on wild rice beds and things, for example, for the wild rice folks or the tribal members that, that's a huge part of their culture, and they're seeing these birds, wipe out acres of wild rice, basically in a couple of weeks. So we're already starting to see, the same complaints that we get for, turkey depredation, or you're talking about bear eating crops or Canada geese crapping on someone's lawn. We're starting to get to a population level for swans that they're just reaching to the point where people are like, okay, well, that's nice to see them, but now they're starting to cause us problems. And yeah, at a federal level, right now they have established, they call it a general swan season for states that would like to look into it. The primary focus of the general swan hunting season is to focus on tundra swans. I think, again, if you look at the requirements, it's supposed to be 90% or more of the birds being harvested in any area is supposed to be on tundra swans, just because that population is much more stable and has quite a few more birds. However,
what's the difference between a trumpeter swan and a tundra swan? I know as an ignorant hunter who's never had an opportunity to hunt these things in his lifetime, so I've never really dug in. I saw them 10 years ago when I started leasing land up in Polk County, and that was the first thing I thought, because I saw them, they all of a sudden showed up right around when the first snowfall came. So I'm thinking, these are, from Canada, and I didn't at that time know anything about trumpeter swan. Come to find out shortly afterwards, they're trumpeter swans, and I've kind of paid attention to it ever since. Do we have migrating tundra swans into Wisconsin, or is that something that's just not a realistic thing at this point?
No, we have. So it's mostly on the Mississippi, but we end up at like a third to almost 40% of the entire tundra swan population. The eastern tundra swan population migrates through the Mississippi River. So
really,
we see a ton of swans on the river, and then we'll get a couple that'll trickle over into Green Bay and Door County area, but the vast majority then migrate down through the Mississippi River, basically hit Illinois, and then generally will then migrate east over to like the Carolinas, where they end up wintering over in that area.
Fascinating. There are certain aspects of waterfowl hunting that I know I could easily geek out in, and these are some of those things. It's one of the reasons why I like woodcock so much, is they're just such a fascinating little bird, and the migration of that. It's very mystical. We as humans, we'd like to even, like I'm sure you see this in your world, we think we know a lot, and we really don't know nearly as much as we think. and through research, I think that has really come to light on a lot of these different things, because I mean, when in history and waterfall management, have you kind of seen the convergence of so much relevant data? And I really think that's been the last 2 decades, really. Am I wrong with that assumption?
No, it's as soon as we started putting on units that could track these birds, whether it's, you get a fix a day, or now we're getting, the technology allows you to get a recording every 15 minutes and it uploads it to a cell phone device.
Yep.
Now so much more. Before, you were kind of relying on bands. You put a band on it, in the north, and you get in the south and you find out how old that bird is and make some assumptions on where that bird traveled. But like you said, over the last 10 to 15 years, the technology has become such that we can track these birds on an hourly basis, and we know where they're spending their time. We know where they stay. We know where they migrate. And then you can use all of that information to look at, okay, well, this is where they're stopping. We go and look at what food they're eating, what their behaviors are, why are they choosing that location over certain other locations. And again, some of the stuff right now, we have light meters on these birds so we can see if they're nesting and then how long they're nesting, and then get an idea of how many eggs they laid because they perform the same behavior for, 8-9 days in a row, and then they sit for 28 or 29 days. So then we know, they probably hatched those birds. So again, there's so much that we can use this information. We got just libraries and libraries right now of digital data that's just waiting for new studies to be taken up because we got more data than we got time and people to actually do the work.
I've been in electronics manufacturing for, well, we'll just say close to 20 years. And I have seen GPS tracking, asset tracking, and the technology that has now being implemented in wildlife management through GPS collars and other banding technology, battery life, solar panels, the data rate and things that you can communicate through, depending on what cell service you're using and, 1G, 2G kind of service for data communication. It is really, it becomes a point, I've seen this in commercial applications where you have too much data and you have to go through it for the relevant data. And to me, it's very exciting to see the DNR and other agencies like this using this information to drive policy, because I understand what it's done in corporate efficiencies, and I can see where it will really help give you guys really the right information to make effective policy decisions and not having gaps and speculation in your findings, more or less. You'll have concrete factual evidence, which I think is super important long-term to sustaining populations with all the different variables that we have facing our wildlife today.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's one of those ones where as funding becomes an issue or as staffing becomes an issue, it's going to be as critical as possible to be as efficient as we can, and using this information and data to make sure that we're doing our best work on those targeted spots are exactly where we need to be. To best bang for our buck is what we need. And like you said, you can't overemphasize how important that's going to be moving forward.
Well, I some of the listeners might be able to draw the correlation without me having to do it, but for sake of our conversation here today, I had Bob Hansen on the podcast. I've had a couple members of the Wisconsin Sharp-tailed Grouse Society on the podcast, and they started implementing GPS tracking on sharp-tails in the last, I think, year, 2 years, might even be less than a year. And the data that they were getting from that was so enlightening to all of them. And for me, seeing where they're at in the process and kind of being able to at least see in a corporate application where this ends up and being able to overlay that and kind of have a little forethought and be able to kind of see what potentially the outcome could be, I was super pumped because the data just didn't exist. People had to go out in the field with, a telemetry RF system and wave a wand around and literally that's how things were tracked. I mean, it was such a labor intensive job before to get data, and then you only had a small window of data. Now you have a timestamp and you have relevant data that you're able to compound it over time, where you couldn't do that before with the data because it was so spotty, where now you have enough data that's sequenced in a fashion that you can draw trends very quickly versus what you could previously do. And you can react a lot faster than what you could previously do. So looking at that going forward for wildlife management, I'm just super stoked because I think it really is being very smart about how we move forward. And I said that word specifically for a reason, because efficiencies are great, but making sure that what we're doing from an action standpoint, that we're making the right move. If you make the right move now versus 5 years after you've done studies and you've kind of fiddled around with it, you're making a much bigger impact today than you are 5 years from now, because you've had 5 years of issues potentially that now you have to recover from. So
Right.
it's a really exciting thing long-term, I think, for wildlife management and for you guys at the state level to make, again, smart policy decisions that ensure that we have these spaces, the critters, and enough room for all of us to enjoy it. There's a big symbiotic relationship here, and I think really, truly the data is going to help bring that into fruition.
Absolutely.
So we've chatted for a few minutes here. I do have to pay a few bills around here at the podcast. So there's going to be a small ad inserted right here, and I need to leave a few seconds of silence.
Sounds good.
Attention landowners. The Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, is now open. CRP is a great opportunity for those hard-to-farm acres. It also helps improve a farm's profitability, delivers high-quality wildlife habitat, clean water, and healthier soils. The CRP sign-up is going on right now through March 11th. Find your local Pheasants Forever biologist at pheasantsforever.org/CRP or visit your local USDA service center. Farm the best, CRP the rest. Taylor, let's jump into the main reason why I reached out to you, and let's chat a little woodcock. My podcast listeners, I think, are outdoorsmen in general, but I would assume if they've listened to 40-some episodes by now, they definitely like upland hunting. And woodcock are, again, one of these species that I don't know that have been studied as in-depth previously as we're starting to kind of get into currently today. And I think where long-term some of the projects that are being worked on are going. So it's very interesting for me to see, again, that enlightenment kind of more or less through the data and through the different means of collecting relevant information to drive policy decisions. So what can you say about Wisconsin woodcock? How was last year in comparison to, say, 2020? Let's start there.
Sure. So last year, the reports that I got in terms from hunters for woodcock was that they had a pretty good year, just because we were pretty dry the previous spring into the summer, which is actually pretty important for woodcock. When things get too wet, then all of a sudden we start losing nests and production goes down. So the fact that things were pretty dry going into the spring of 2021 boded well for woodcock production.
So real quickly with that, how when let's say I'm planning a trip up to Wisconsin from another state and I'm trying to pay attention to spring rains, and I think most people are coming up here to grouse hunt, and the woodcock is a very, I guess, glad and thankful and we'll take it kind of second bird.
Right.
So I think people are kind of looking at the weather going, okay, well, what's best affected, what's going to lead to the best brood success rate in grouse? Are the woodcock conditions that lead to a very good woodcock hunting, that dry, is that also good for grouse? I know that when we get wet seasons that you lose clutches and things and lose nests of grouse as well, because we had that a couple of years ago. But is there a difference, kind of perfect moisture for woodcock versus grouse, or are they kind of like it will have a good year if they have the same amount of moisture?
In most cases, they'll have a good year, both grouse and woodcock, if conditions are pretty good. If the things tend to be a little bit more wet, woodcock tend to do a little bit better because, again, they primarily are foraging on worms and things along those lines. So if there's a little bit of moisture, a little bit of damp, it's okay. But like I said, if you get large rain events or significant like snow events, like I think was it a couple of years ago in April, we got 20 inches of snow in certain parts of the state. That's that really impacts those birds negatively. So for our upland birds, grouse, turkey,
I'll definitely for surely, I can draw that correlation 100% from what I saw in conditions out in the field. That was it 2 years ago we had that spring snow event, and that fall was very poor in an area that has been traditionally very, very good woodcock hunting. There were plenty of woodcock, but they were just not as nearly as many as there were the year before. And part of that, is a little bit flight conditions, but we were hunting birds that should have been local birds, and we just weren't seeing them like we had in the past. And then the flight showed up, and everybody was happy, and then I think we got froze out on like October 26th or something like that, and they all disappeared. But it was kind of, and that's why I love hunting them, because they're just such you got to get after them now, because you don't know that next cold snap they could be gone. And they're an interesting critter. But anyways, I'm sorry I took you down a rabbit hole. 2021 woodcock season, it was fairly good because we had a drier spring.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and again, the reports were, typically we get here our best reports right around that full moon, around Halloween. If you get any type of north wind around that last full moon in October, that's when we usually see some of our best woodcock hunting. But this year it tended to be a little bit later, is what the reports that I ended up hearing. But again, I'd be willing to, it's one of those things, and I had this discussion with you, that Wisconsin ranks, I think this last year we ranked number 1 in terms of woodcock harvest and number 2 in terms of woodcock hunters. But very rarely do I get people to reach out to me to tell me how their season was or how everything went. So,
well, let's talk about that for a quick second, because I think woodcock are starting to get kind of a spotlight, at least in Minnesota. We've got places like Pine Ridge Grouse Camp, and they do a woodcock banding program, and where they'll train you and your dog, and you can help out with the state and federal level for their banding program. So there's some attention over on the Minnesota side. Wisconsin doesn't have that program. What is your metric outside? I got a survey from the DNR, actually, I just sent in the other day, about small game hunting. There was a little bit of woodcock information on there, but regardless, that survey sat on my desk for a month. What is the primary mechanism for you guys collecting information from hunters? Is it mostly just hunters reaching out to you?
So it depends on which scale we're talking about. At a state level, in most cases it's that small game.
Let's start at the state level, I guess. I mean, you're a state guy, so I don't even know that we need to talk too much feds, but I guess you could enlighten us on how it all works.
Yeah. Like I said, at a state level, we do the small game survey. And then again, it's hunters reaching out to me or to their biologist, and then the county biologist will then, forward their information my way, basically on, whether hunters had a good season or a bad season, or what hunters would like to see for, a season structure moving forward. At the federal level, we do similar to mourning dove and similar to ducks and geese. They send out a harvest log or a wing envelope for those hunters that, whatever they, when you do your HIP survey, they ask you, do you hunt woodcock? Do you hunt mourning dove? Do you hunt ducks and geese? And that puts you into certain categories. And then they'll take that information and they'll send out envelopes to people. And if you shot a lot of woodcock, you would be a high harvest woodcock hunter. And you'll send in your wings, and then they use their models and estimates to then estimate how many woodcock are harvested on an annual basis. So, at the federal level, that's where we get how many woodcock are shot, is based on the wings that are submitted and how many are submitted and who all submits them. And then we can throw that into our model to estimate exactly what harvest was at a federal level. But at a state level, we do our best with random mail surveys that we send out to hunters, and then hunters reaching out to us. Makes
sense. Is there a desire at the state level to collect more information on woodcock?
So, I mean, it's one of those ones where, yeah, and
we won't be offended on how you answer. I'm just just curious with the question.
The thing is if I get 5 comments a year, that's usually a pretty big year. So, and you only ever hear from people that are angry. You never hear from hunters that are having a good experience or a good hunting season. So if I'm not hearing from, 99% of the woodcock hunters, my assumption are that they're having a good season or they're having a good experience. So at this point, until we would hear from, a strong majority or something that would really shake things up and, rally woodcock hunters together to say we need to make a change, at this point, the department feels pretty comfortable with where we're at with the data that we have, because again, if we're not making people mad, then we're assuming that they're happy.
Yes. And, you have to, in order to move forward. You can't be hung up on the fact that you didn't hear from anybody. However, I will poke the average listener here who does woodcock hunt in Wisconsin that you can get a hold of Taylor and share your even good hunting experiences, because he wants to know those things. And I did just encourage, listeners to contact your specific biologist at the state and share your information from the field, whether or not it's relevant or whether or not you think it's information that the DNR needs. You'd be surprised. So,
yeah, please do. Most cases, woodcock numbers are doing well. Same thing with waterfowl numbers are doing well. Most of our hunting season decisions are based on the social aspect of what hunters would like to see. Because populations are doing well, we base those decisions on what we hear from people. So again, you guys hunters help drive what those decisions are, especially when we have populations of, migratory birds where the populations are doing really well.
Well, and I think you can specifically use an inference in that. Recently, Wisconsin changed the teal season.
Absolutely.
And I think that's probably a direct result of that communication.
Yep. Yeah. Every year. So we do an annual process where we collect public input, and we did the same thing with hen mallards. We were allowed to have, we only had 1 hen mallard in the bag limit, and we ended up doing a bunch of research and analysis that says that we can harvest 2 hen mallards. So we have the data that suggests we could do it, but we went out to ask hunters whether or not they felt comfortable doing so. Because again, at that point we knew we could, but it's a social consideration for people that what they were thinking about it. And same thing, like I said, with the teal season, we started with a 7-day teal season. We're allowed a 16-day teal season. So at this point, whatever hunters are comfortable with, what they feel like, that they want to have a season for, that's what we're asking for the feedback from hunters. Cause I'm not just sitting up creating hunting seasons for myself. We're doing it for the 80,000 migratory bird hunters in the state of Wisconsin.
Well, and that's really good to hear. And I do think Wisconsin is a very unique case for working with outdoorsmen and women and hunters, people who use these spaces. And I think you guys, the interaction level is a lot greater because of the Conservation Congress and the way things are kind of interaction is allowed to take place with the DNR, the policymakers, and the decision people, and us outdoors people as well. That doesn't really exist in Minnesota in that fashion. So I'm using that as kind of a business case, I guess you could say, for that personal relationship that you guys have with us as outdoors people in the state. And I really think it drives effective policy, and it allows the conversation to exist between a hunter and biologist. And that's important.
Right.
You have to have that communication line. Otherwise, people get alienated, and it just doesn't lead to, the 3 R's and all these things, initiatives that we're all trying to get to.
Yeah, it's one of those things when I go out and if I can collect, input from 3,000 hunters on what the migratory bird seasons are going to be, it makes it a whole lot more difficult for one person way up high in the chain to change the decision based on what they heard from the one or two people that may be talking to them. So that's why I always emphasize for hunters to reach out and to provide that, because again, you may not necessarily get the exact scenario that you wish, but your voice was heard and was included and counted and directly impacted what the season will be. Again, it may not necessarily be the season that you wanted, but please be rest assured that I read every email. I listened to every phone call. We record all of that information, and those are the decisions that are made. So then at a higher level or at a legislative level, seasons aren't necessarily changed because we have the input and data from hunters directly saying this is what we want. And that's really important.
It is 100% crucial. As otherwise, it just leads to problems. And I think effectively you guys have done a great job. So we beat that one a little bit. Back to woodcock a little bit more. Let me think here. What exactly do I want to find out from the biologist? Where do you see the highest concentration of migratory birds, and is that different from where you see the highest concentration of resident birds?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yes, our migratory birds we end up seeing a lot more, I would say, in the northwest portion of the state, because again, depending on where those birds are choosing to migrate, you'll see a pretty significant buildup of those migratory birds waiting for quality conditions to jump that big water. So we end up seeing a lot of really good concentrations of migratory birds in those quality habitats adjacent to Green Bay, adjacent to Lake Michigan, whereas our local birds, central Wisconsin, the north central part of the state, basically wherever we have really good young forest habitat, we see really good numbers of our local birds in that area. So again, just kind of somewhat of a shift in terms of where those birds are trying to congregate before they make their big push south versus the birds that need that quality habitat for a year-round basis.
So another question for you from, again, let's say you got an out-of-state guy looking to come up to hunt, and let's say he actually wants to hunt woodcock. There's a much different approach to hunting woodcock in northern Wisconsin than there is in, say, southern Wisconsin or your specific area. Now, I wouldn't necessarily personally travel to, say, the Wisconsin Dells area to shoot woodcock, but you have some significant amount of county forest not too terribly far northwest of you or northeast of you that has some decent habitat, but it's different. So what would be a key if a guy called you, was looking to get into woodcock, and he was hunting in southern Wisconsin? What would be kind of a key habitat that you'd tell him to kind of focus on?
I would say your tag alder, brushy riverine riparian areas. Again, because we don't have the huge concentrations of pulp type timber around here. So I was
kind of thinking, any kind of low lying creek bed area or, shelf along any kind of waterway that is swampy-ish in nature with tag elders.
Yep. Absolutely. That would be my recommendation. And that's where I see most of my birds in the fall.
And if I had a personal recommendation, I'd just say, hey, drive a few hours north of there. You're going to get into a lot better cover.
You're going to see a little bit more birds.
But you have, and this is the cool thing about woodcock. I think of a couple marshy areas that I've hunted in southern Wisconsin. I've moved some grouse in. Not your traditional grouse cover, but it has enough there to hold birds. And I've been in areas where you wouldn't move a woodcock one day and you'd get into there the next day and you'd get 45 flushes. And it's just that nature of the flight and their migratory pattern that they could really end up just about anywhere in the fall when they're coming through.
Yeah, I mean, if you
Hell,
anytime
I've found
spent
them out in
in,
the middle of a pheasant field during pheasant season. One of them, the day before it closed.
yeah,
I actually shot it and I go, shit, did the season close? I looked, I'm like, oh, I got a day yet.
lucked out,
I
lucked out.
didn't break the law. But it was just such a, I'd been hunting them for 5 weeks already. And so it was such nature to pull the gun up on it when I saw it was a woodcock. And I was not expecting it to be a woodcock, but everything happens so fast when you're hunting like that. And yeah, it was crazy. In the middle of a CRP field, there happened to be a small little willow patch, and I'll be damned, that's where he was. Perfect spot for where I would find him in the springtime.
Right.
And we go out and do a little bit of the training on them in the springtime when they show back up, because they're just such a fantastic bird to work with for pointing dogs. And gosh, I can't put a pigeon or a quail out and duplicate the same scenario as my dogs going out and finding them in the springtime when they come up. But yeah, it's very interesting, the different covers that you find them in versus in the springtime versus in the fall. I kind of that springtime, they call it kind of a second season, and some of the big dog handlers, and it took me a little while to figure out where they hang in the springtime. Totally different covers.
And for those fall hunters, the DNR, Wisconsin DNR, has a pretty cool tool. It's called Flight with 2 F's. So Flight.
You're giving away all that good info. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
A lot of that information.
It's funny. We created that, and that was the response that we got from all of the old time woodcock and grouse hunters. Are like, wait, now you're telling everybody they didn't have to walk 20 miles a day to find the good habitat, but.
No, actually, when I got my pointing dog, and I really kind of ramped up my upland hunting in Wisconsin, I found that before really Onyx came around, and then Onyx came, and I think they incorporate that flight data into the Onyx app, but unbelievable information, how enlightening that was, and how kick-ass it was, because it made me way more efficient. And when you're hunting with dogs, it's a paradigm you have, or a paradox that you have to balance. You've got dog power versus how much time you can spend in the field, and
right.
They don't equal. I can spend all day walking trails, but my dogs aren't going to do it. At least not. They'll do it, but not effectively. So to be able to cut down some of that exploration time and know that, hey, I'm walking down this trail and in 10 minutes I'm going to get into at least what the DNR is marked as decent grouse cover or woodcock cover. It really, and now I find that it's not 100% accurate. It's new growth forest. Well, grouse hang out in, certain types of cover during certain types of years. So you might be going back to something that's more predominantly oak than it is aspen.
Right.
And you'll find that there'll be a certain time of year the birds will be in there, and a certain time of year they won't be. And that's just one of the games you got to play, but it's still hunting, right? But you guys have made that flight information is super useful for anybody who's looking to hunt Wisconsin. If they haven't used it, I can highly recommend and attest to the fact that it will put you on good quality cover. Did I lose you, Taylor?
Nope, I got you. Yep. No, right. Sorry. Yep. Yeah, no, again, it's one of those ones where, we identify, tag all their property. We identify where we have that young forest or young aspen stands. And for the people in the southern half of the state, we identify our managed dove fields on there too, where we plant sunflowers or we plant wheat. So it's, an interactive mapping tool that you can zoom in and print maps out. And yeah, it's been one of those things where it's a love-hate relationship with certain folks that are mad that they had to stomp the ground to find all of their good spots, and then the DNR in one swift push, gave all that information out to the guy who didn't have to do it. But again, for our new hunters or for people that are new to the area, it's been an awesome tool.
So I just refreshed my little piece of paper here and kind of a couple topics that we had jotted down, and a few things that I want to make sure we cover here before we end the call for today. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state, and let's talk about woodcock management, but I think you can throw all of migratory birds into that category. How does that work for just the average outdoorsman that doesn't understand the hierarchy? The federal level sets a certain season limit or time length, and then you guys can adjust that per state level. Can you kind of enlighten us a little bit more on that? Because it was really interesting to me when we were talking the other day about how all that worked. I was not aware of that.
Yeah, so with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, again, because these birds migrate across both state and country boundaries, the idea is that we want to manage them as a unit. So for us within the Mississippi Flyway, it's 14 states and 3 Canadian provinces. We work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who have developed, we would say, sidelines or boundaries in terms of what the bag limits would be and what the season structure, the length would be. And they allow states within those boundaries to tailor them to their own state level. So again, for every state, for ducks, you're allowed a 60-day duck hunting season, whether you're in Wisconsin or you're in Louisiana. And say the season has to fall between the Saturday near September 24th to January 31st. So Wisconsin can take, say, we want to move those 60 days. We're going to obviously start as early as possible, because in most years we don't even get through those full 60 days because things start freezing up. Whereas Louisiana is going to start on January 1st and work their way backwards. So it's one of those ones that we want to manage them as a collective unit, because you don't want, say, Wisconsin, Minnesota having a higher bag limit, and then all of a sudden there's less birds for those guys down south, versus season length and bag limit being different down south. We've let all of our birds that we produced up here migrate down there and then just get shot. So yeah, is with relation to the migratory birds. And similar thing for woodcock in terms of hunting seasons. We're allowed a 45-day season per the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we try to, match up those 45 days with the best 45 days in the state of Wisconsin to capture the most opportunity for hunters.
I personally think you guys are doing a good job with picking the season dates. The start date, there's always controversy around that, but at the end of the day, the real heart of the woodcock hunting is in anywhere from, early October really through the end of October. And really It's that, like you said, full moon, end of the time where, the whitetail guys are going, I got to get in a tree. It's usually when grouse and woodcock peaks.
Right. Yeah, that's been one of the big discussions that we've had at the flyway level. And I know, so Michigan has a lot of grouse hunters, and for them, they've had a big push lately to try to allow the woodcock season to start a week earlier. Right now, the earliest that the woodcock season can start is usually a week after when the grouse season starts in both Wisconsin and Minnesota, or in Michigan. And, Michigan has kind of said, for simplicity's sake, they would like to lump those two openings together. And that's been the big discussion, because as, from Wisconsin's perspective, I would have a tough time believing that our woodcock hunters here in Wisconsin would like to open up a week earlier and then sacrifice a week on the end, just because, conditions and that early part of September, they could be a lot of leaves on the trees, and it makes it much more difficult to shoot woodcock during that time period. And I would think that your opportunities would be better at the end of the season than that first week of the season. But these are the types of discussions that we have at the flyway level, at the federal level, And that this is why it is important to hear from hunters in Wisconsin. So we're not making these decisions, in a vacuum.
Yeah, no, in my opinion, is just my opinion, and it's based on the last decade of being in the woods chasing these critters. But yeah, I could argue a little bit for bringing those two dates up together. And the only reason I say that is because I would tend to believe, what did woodcock close last year? November 6th?
November 4th. Yeah, somewhere in there, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd almost venture to say that the last 5-ish years, I've had a very, very limited success in that first couple days in November. Very limited.
Okay.
And it's so weather dependent, though. You can get it one Indian summer in October, and you will have woodcock here till opening of gun hunting.
Right.
And we've had that. The only reason I'd say I'd trade the front for the back is because I've had the woodcock flight disappear in end of October, and it'd be nice to be able to shoot a woodcock when you run across it in opening of grouse hunting. But honestly, I think for grouse hunting, I'd rather bring grouse hunting back to the opening of woodcock and get another week on the backside of grouse hunting.
Right.
That's so there's that paradigm there that everybody's got a little bit of a differing opinion, and it's very important to hear from us as hunters when do we want to spend the time out in the woods.
Absolutely.
So it's really awesome to hear that, again, Taylor, open ears. And I can't encourage listeners enough. If you want to share your thoughts and opinions with the DNR, and specifically anything migratory bird related, Taylor's the guy. So feel free to do so. I wanted to touch back on we were talking about it earlier. Banding is one of the things I wanted to touch base on too, that I didn't have on the list, but I think a lot of listeners are kind of like myself maybe, and never really, I shot a banded woodcock. I've shot a banded duck or two over the years. And I think we all have kind of an envisioned reality about how you guys go about putting these bands on anything. We've seen a few things on television and stuff, but through talking with Bob Hansen about the sharp-tailed grouse, it was very neat to hear how the DNR goes about capturing these animals to band them. So could you maybe enlighten some of the listeners on what a day of banding, you did some out east too. So what's your banding day look like?
Yeah. And again, it all depends on what type of habitat that you're working with. So
sure.
I've banded, so I'm going to rely on ducks, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about how some other states do band woodcock, but just to give you an idea in terms of ducks and geese.
Yeah.
I banded ducks from an airboat at nighttime. So when they molt, they'll molt during June and July. And then that's also the same time period where the ducklings don't have their flight feathers yet. So you can chase them down in a regular boat or an airboat with a muskie net, and you can scoop them up that way. And you're basically just running them down and scooping them up because they can't get away from you. We've done it with cannon and rocket nets, where
that's the one way I've kind of envisioned and I've seen it done.
Right. Yeah. We have a spot that's pretty close to water that we will bait with cob corn in most cases. And you'll end up baiting a spot for 2 or 3 weeks to get those birds, identifying and associating that that's someplace that they can come and get this corn. And then we have we have basically nets with weights attached to an explosive that will shoot that weight, and which has the net attached to it, over the top of those birds once we get an ideal amount of birds underneath the net there. And so, we've had cases where, like at Grand River Marsh here in Wisconsin, I think the biggest shot that I've been under was 750 birds we got in a single net.
Holy
and that
cow.
was and that was maybe half of what was there. Half of them flew away from that. So,
well, no wonder you guys, had no wonder the DNR and the feds put so many restrictions on these waterfowl hunters back in the early 1900s. Because hell, if you can have an apparatus and get 700 ducks with one swoop,
right?
Not too many times out to do that. There ain't gonna be any left.
Right.
I can see how these market hunters wipe things out, I guess is kind of my point.
So yeah, those are probably, we have that, and then we have the walk-in traps, which is basically a confusion trap where we'll put corn inside this mesh trap on the ground where the ducks will walk in there, and they can walk in, but they can't walk out. And so that one makes it a lot easier because it's a lot less time intensive. You only have to have one or two people watching it versus, a rocket net operation with 700 birds as you got 8-9 people setting it up, and then you have 15-20 people banding birds because you want to reduce the amount of stress on those birds. And if you got that many,
huge operation.
Yeah. So with that, so those are the big ones for Canada geese. Most of our banding, it's again when they're molting, and we have a bunch of volunteers, and they carry these big panel like nets that you go to a park or you go to a field and you have everybody surround them, and then just continue to walk in with your panel, and they can't fly away. So you just keep closing, and then you build a pen right around them. So
that sounds like a fun experience. One would tend to believe you might need a decent coat of body armor.
Yeah, geese. You don't wear a t-shirt banding geese.
They're nasty, man.
They can beat you up. And then for woodcock, we have, there's two different methodologies. I know up north here, and then in Minnesota, and you can maybe attest to it, it's typically done with private individuals using dogs where they'll, similar situation, these birds aren't necessarily flighted yet, and then they'll train to get a dog on a bird and then capture it that way. Whereas down south, where the birds are flighted, they do somewhat of a mist net situation where they find areas where these woodcock are congregating on the wintering grounds, and they'll put up big, large mist nets in areas that they know that these birds fly through. And then they essentially chase the birds into this net that's stretched across this open area, and then the birds get caught up in it.
Kind of similar to, I've seen some projects on how they trap bats as they fly at night. Yep. Is it kind of similar if somebody had that vision in their head?
Yep, exactly the same.
Okay. Interesting. Just to find this fascinating because I think a lot of people, we go out and hunt, but we don't necessarily think this deep into some of these topics. And I think it's very interesting to hear. So let's touch base a little bit on mallard GPS research, because I think, like the Trumpeter Swans, you guys were seeing some success in that. And then I want to touch base on two other quick topics. I think actually one of them we'll leave off. I think we might have to have you back on the show to talk about a couple of these topics in a little bit more detail, but
sure.
It'd be at a later date, and we can touch base on my little thorn in the side duck stamp deal. But any mallard research, and then I want to close out with just some Canadian geese stuff, because I think a lot of people encounter them more than they used to in the cities, and they're little pesky things, and I wish they were flying along my cornfield. That was so easy to just pick them off and get it was great. I used to call them sausage birds, because we'd go out and get a few of them and breast them out, and we'd throw them in with the venison and make sausage, or make sausage or jerky out of them. Wasn't really much of a roasted goose breast guy, although I've had it cooked fairly well before, not by myself, but by somebody else. It was kind of surprising that was goose. Regardless of that, I do want to touch base on some of the kind of the misnomers and just clear a few things up, I guess, maybe. But let's talk about mallards in the state of Wisconsin and some of the research you guys have done over the last few years and how that's been kind of enlightening, what you guys have found.
Right. So, we have a pretty significant mallard GPS tracking study right now. It's a Great Lakes region-wide type of study. We have a PhD student out of the University of Michigan, that we're putting these backpack transmitters, they're solar powered backpack transmitters that every 15 minutes upload a location. And as soon as they become in a cell phone area, it'll upload it to, a computer that you can then access the data to. And we're asking ourselves a bunch of questions because our Great Lakes mallard populations have kind of shown a slight dip to leveling out, whereas at a continental level, our mallard populations continue to grow. And we're trying to figure out what's going on here because the slight dip in our mallard numbers didn't necessarily indicate any difference in terms of our hunters and our harvest. They were still seeing the same amount of birds. So how come we were counting less birds during our spring survey versus the birds that were maybe available to hunt, and then what people were counting out west in the prairie pothole region? So that was what really initiated this study. And so what we're getting is we're actually pulling blood. We're going to be looking at genetics, and I'll touch base on that in a second, but also how are these birds behaving? Where are they staging? Where are they migrating to? And one of the big questions we're trying to ask ourselves is, are these birds that we consider, are we seeing a lot more birds moving into these urban areas, taking advantage of that, the fact that they're not going to be hunted, taking advantage of open water for most of the year, taking advantage of just basically really good habitat that they know that there's no threat of danger. And that associated with the fact is we don't fly any of our spring waterfowl surveys over these urban areas because we don't count ducks in the city of Milwaukee. We don't count ducks in Green Bay. Yet we know last year the Green Bay Duck Hunters Association had volunteers capture birds within the greater Green Bay area, the urban part of Green Bay area, and put them out on some of our wildlife areas. And last year there was 2,000 birds they transplanted from urban Green Bay out to, some of our wildlife areas. So we know that there's a pretty significant number of birds in these areas that we're not counting. And is that somewhat incorporating or, associating that decline that we were seeing? Additionally, we're trying to figure out in the Atlantic flyway for the last 40, 50 years, hunt clubs out there will bolster their mallard numbers by raising farm-raised mallards and releasing them. So, the private hunt clubs will release them. So then the person that pays the money to come hunt out there has, birds to hunt.
That's not only just out east. I don't know specifically Wisconsin game farm rules, but I've looked into game farms before, and I mostly because of being a young hunter, I wanted to get my dog on birds, which was a whole nother topic and not the greatest solution if you want to train a great wild bird dog, but it all depends on what strokes you want. There's different strokes for different folks. My point is I've seen game farms around the Midwest here that have ducks that you can go out and shoot, and not everybody hits that pheasant or duck that was put out at the game farm, and they don't typically constrict themselves to 120 acres. So,
right.
These birds are, my point is mixing with our native genetic line of birds, and even though it looks the same and acts the same, at some point there's domesticated effect on that gene pool, and that bird gets out, and I don't know that we know the dynamics to that. And I think that's what you guys are trying to figure out. And I apologize to take away from your comment there, but my point was it's not just out east where it's probably more prevalent out east. They're introducing these birds, but they're still doing it all over.
Right. And that's exactly what we're trying to answer, is that those game farm raised mallards are from a European stock, whereas we want to see, and again, what they're finding out in the Atlantic flyway is that the mallard population has been going down over the last decade or so. And they're trying to identify to see if those European stock mallards are having a negative influence on our North American stock mallards in terms of their fitness and their ability to survive. And so there's studies going on the Atlantic flyway and then here in the Great Lakes to see if we're starting to get, any significant intermingling of those two genes And is that also, contributing to the fact that we're potentially counting less mallards in the Great Lakes area? So, yeah, the amount of, like we were talking earlier.
Quick, curious. So when you go in to do a study like this, at some point we decide to do the study. So there's a timestamp started, right? How do you establish a baseline genetics? Because we can't go back in history. But I know genetics, there's a lot you can do with history. So do you try to find like a sample pool of, or like a baseline pool of migrating birds that are from up north that are in, pristine kind of what you would be ideal condition from a genetic standpoint, and that's kind of your baseline? Or do you just kind of pick a sampling of what's out there today, there's the baseline, and then going forward through the study, you look for indicators over that period of time to see that genetic difference?
Fortunately for waterfowl, we have
and
been
again,
pulling feathers.
I don't know if I'm asking something that's, ignorant or not.
No. Fortunately for waterfowl, we've been pulling feathers and pulling blood from ducks
I suppose that's got
like
genetics.
almost 100 years. Yeah. So we've been doing it for a long, long time. So I'm just bins and bins full of feathers from the 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s.
And you can get enough of a genetic signature off of that to kind of establish your baseline for the study. That's really cool.
Yep.
I again wouldn't have known that. Thinking of this and being kind of a detail oriented guy, I was like, well, where's the baseline drawn? And how do you know what you're studying is actually impacting? And I genetics and computers, they do a lot of things I don't know that all of us people that aren't in that space know.
Right.
But at the same time, on a high level, I think it's a little puzzling for some people. So I appreciate you kind of shedding a little light there.
Yeah. So like you said, we put almost 45 transmitters on birds in 2021, and I think we're trying to get close to 60 out in 2022, and that's just Wisconsin. I think Michigan and Ohio and Indiana are all going to be trying to do the same exact thing. So, I mean, this is going to be a massive study, and I think it's really going to be important to find out this information and determine where we're going to be moving forward here. So really looking forward to it.
It sounds exciting. You'll have to definitely keep me in the loop here. I would love to. When's the study when's it supposed to conclude, or is it an ongoing study? Is there a report function coming at some point?
Yeah. So the PhD students started in 2021. Typically, they like to wrap those things up in about 4 to 5 years.
Okay.
So I would imagine, we're getting into year 2, year 3. We'll start getting reports in terms of where these birds are. We right now have pretty good information on where the birds that we marked here in Wisconsin, where they're wintering, where they're spending their time. Now those birds that we marked this year that survived to this upcoming spring, we'll get an idea of where they're spending their time in nesting. We'll get a lot more information. So yeah, I would suspect in the next 3 to 4 years, we're going to have some really, really cool information to share with the public.
That's very cool. We'll have to stay in touch. Anything that you wanted to wrap up that we didn't fully bring around full circle? We talked about trumpeter swans. We talked about woodcock, hunter engagement from a data and just a survey standpoint. How we went down a bunch of little rabbit holes here. So.
Yeah, I mean, if you just wanted to touch base in terms of Canada geese, they're becoming one of those things that I'm focusing a lot more of my time on an annual basis, dealing with nuisance Canada geese than I ever thought I would be doing when you take the position.
I used to have a customer down in Waukesha, Wisconsin. I'd go visit, and there was a particular restaurant I enjoyed stopping at in the summer because they had just exceptional ice cream, and I'm a milkshake guy, so I'm a sucker for milkshakes. And if I didn't have anything else, or it was around lunchtime, I'd stop there all the time. Well, I'll tell you, if you stop there in the early part of summer when those birds were nesting, and There was one door you didn't want to go in because
Yep.
in one year that the female had made a nest in the planter next to the door, and the sentinel male, I got within 5 feet of the curb, and there's another 3 feet of curbing there, so about 10
Yep.
feet from this bird. I didn't see it. I didn't see the bird in the nest, and it came out from underneath the bush basically, and I damn near took my hand off. I mean, I just one of those things where you kind of crap your pants because you weren't expecting it, and it made me, big burly, guy here, look kind of like a little girl. I had that happen to me one other time on a black bear a couple of years ago, where I had a trail camera up and on a cornfield, and I look up and I'm looking at 2 eyes on a 350-pound boar, and he's about 5 feet from me. And before I could get my hand on the 44 Magnum, I let out the scream like, a little girl saw a ghost or something, and that bear cleared the cornfield before I ever got the gun out of the holster.
Right.
But my point is, it was kind of scary, and I can imagine you're dealing with a ton of complaints from golf course owners, people who live on golf courses, people who live near parks, people who have any kind of visit any parks with any kind of ponds. I've noticed a huge change in their patterns around Appleton when I was growing up. Like I said earlier, it's just sit in the cornfield. We'd throw a burlap sack over us with a couple silhouette decoys out, and we'd just hammer the geese. We'd be done with our limits, and back then limits were kind of tight, but we'd be done in an hour. And it was almost a guarantee we were going to get some birds when we went hunting. And I wasn't even a good goose caller back then. Still am not. But I remember before I left there, and this goes back 10 years ago, and since then a lot of the land that we owned has been developed, but none of it was when I left. And you couldn't buy a flock of geese to come over and give your decoys a look, because they were heading to areas that were unhuntable. And even within, the town of Menasha annex shotguns, yep. I think around when I was kind of getting out of high school, or in when I tried to go to college, I realized I could get out and work and make money really quickly. And I'm like, well, why am I paying for a diploma when I can actually make money? But it's a whole nother life decision. But even then, like when the Menasha annexed shotguns, it was a big deal, because we had one of the properties bordered the town of Menasha, so we could shoot guns in the north side of the road. And I'll be damned, it wasn't but 2-3 years after that, and we never saw any geese come by. They were all heading to Menasha. They'd skip our field over. So I've seen that change, and I've noticed congregations of waterfowl, all different types, in a lot more urban scenarios than what I remember growing up. So what I'm assuming you guys are doing a ton of studies on this, but what are you guys finding? Like, what is it taking away from the traditional flyways?
It's one of those ones, especially for Canada geese, just their whole life span and cycle here has just been crazy. In like the 1960s and 70s, there were no geese in the state of Wisconsin that bred here. I mean, they were all coming from Ontario and then migrating to Horicon, where they all spent all their time in Horicon, and then they would pick up from Horicon and then go down to Illinois and get down into Tennessee and Kentucky. And now, we have our own giant Canada goose, or our temperate breeding Canada geese, these ones that breed here in Wisconsin. And it's gone, where they would go where all the geese were, which was on really good habitat like Horicon.
I have to apologize to both you and the listeners here. I have my phone on Do Not Disturb. We've had technical difficulties today. I had my email closed earlier. That dinged on us, and I just got a phone call here. So I'm probably going to leave that in, Taylor. But again, I heard something through that process that was interesting. I didn't know. There's a specific subcategory or species of Canadian geese that you guys have identified that live in the state. Is that what I understand?
So yeah, genetically they're all exactly the same, but
Sure.
the way they behave is completely different.
Yeah.
So we have a population that migrates from Ontario up on the Hudson Bay coast. They'll migrate, and they tend to be almost half the size of the geese that breed here in Wisconsin because they're migrating, thousands of miles, versus our own giant Canada goose, or what we call temperate breeding Canada geese.
Okay, that's what I heard.
In most years, if we don't have snow, they don't go much further south than the Wisconsin-Illinois state line.
And I've killed a few of those over the years, and they are tanks. They are substantially larger than flight birds.
Right. So again, that's the group that we're seeing in these urban areas because they've learned that, we are going to survive if we spend most of our time not flying anywhere else other than the places where people can't shoot us. And like we pointed out earlier, that becomes a big issue with the other people using the landscape, whether it's the golf course people or the people trying to use the beach.
Well, I think
birds are on.
There's also the issue that the hunter's kind of pissed off that the birds are in the city now. They see them when they leave in the morning to go hunt, and then they see them when they get home from hunting, but they don't see them when they're hunting anymore. I mean, and it's not necessarily that specifically bad paradigm, but I think that exists because I definitely know from at least a mallard standpoint, my retention pond 2 blocks down the road is loaded right now with mallards, and they don't leave. They're here all year round. Now, whether or not it's those specific birds, I don't know. I don't study them, but there's birds in that retention pond all year round when the water's open, and it doesn't take but a small melt here, and they're open. And I don't live too far from a power plant here, and that is usually open all year because they pump hot water into the pond down there, and there's always a ton. And it doesn't hurt that I'm near, national wildlife refuge either. Mm-hmm. But those things attract the animals, and they're all here. So these birds on very, very cold winters some will leave, but there's always open water somewhere on the river around the city here. And I know up in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, there's a resident population of geese up there that don't leave that specific area due to the power plant up there. It's always open water up there. So it's definitely a change in habit or in behavioral patterns. So it's how does the DNR, because you're getting so many complaints, I think hunters I don't know that the average hunter would tell you they're upset, but I think it's definitely a concern of theirs, and I don't think they like passing a bunch of geese in the park and going out to the field and not seeing any.
Right.
What's the thought process on trying to tackle this issue?
Yeah, it's been one of those. It's been tough because we're not in the business of translocating geese. Just because
I don't think it's going to be a problem. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a solution.
No,
you can't trap them all.
Right. And then again, they have wings. So eventually they're going to make their way back, no matter how far you end up taking them, or else you just picked them up and gave them to somebody else as a problem.
That's the bigger issue, I think. You're just moving the problem.
Right. And so and
then typically when you move a problem, you create bigger problems,
Yeah. So the DNR, we have a program. The DNR doesn't necessarily, we run, or I would say USDA Wildlife Services. So this is U.S. Department of Agriculture. They work with municipalities to round up these Canada geese that are the ones that are causing problems, or, are nuisance, or are like really causing issues. And the USDA makes them go through a whole process of trying all these different methods to scare them away with lasers, or to have people with dogs try to chase them away or whatever, before we get to a certain point where they round them up. And then if they end up having to get to that point, the USDA will round those birds up and then they euthanize those birds, but then donate them to zoos, or they donate them to food pantries, or they donate them to other areas that are going to utilize those. They don't get landfilled, they don't get trashed. So, I mean, that's one of those things where it works for a little while, but what you've done is create a vacuum for other geese to come to the spot where they knew that they were going to be. So I don't see this being a thing that we can ever figure out completely.
And that's because it's a multifaceted problem, and unfortunately, you've got people, you've got a lot of parties involved. Number one, anytime you got interagency stuff between U.S. Fish and Wildlife, USDA, Wisconsin DNR, I mean, that's going to be a difficult situation. Let's just put it out there. I'm not afraid to personally say that. I know you got to toe some lines. You say what you need to, Taylor. But with that being said, you also have different dynamics in people. You've got one neighbor who doesn't want the goose shit on his yard, excuse my French, but that's the way it is. And then you got the next lady who's feeding them. And those are politics you can't solve as a government, as any kind of outside agency. It is between two people. And then fortunately that exists on a micro scale and a macro scale. And, it's a very tough thing to deal with and balance. I think what everybody wants in life, everybody wants to live in a beautiful community, and that includes wildlife. And, it's tough for people that may be more urban than people that are more agricultural related in their lifestyle to kind of deal with the issue of how do we control that population. And it's just, there's more voices and there's more differing opinions where it just becomes a very, very, very complex issue super quickly. And I can see that. As a hunter, I will say that there's, I think a lot of us hunters look at it a hell of a lot more simple than that.
Right.
And I do think long term, we're going to probably have to look at simpler issue or ways of dealing with these things than, 3 government agencies getting involved in making sure everybody feels happy about how they're playing in the sandbox. At some point, the airports bring out the snipers and they kill all the deer. I mean, the people, everybody in the city might not understand that, but that's what happens.
The local golf course allow hunters on there during, the fall after they close their season down, or does, I think there are ways that some of these municipalities can allow things to be done safely, but we have to get to a point where people are comfortable with that.
Well, and I encourage hunters to be involved in that conversation before other people who don't hunt take the conversation over, because I think there are ways, and I think there are really good ways that we can utilize something like that. Think about a scenario where you could take a kid or an adult who's never been out in a setting like that, and you pretty much kind of have a game farm guaranteed setup. And you can really utilize those scenarios to an advantage to promote responsible and ethical outdoors people. I mean, think about that. And it's kind of a unique scenario that not every place can do this, but I can think of a half a dozen golf courses I know of that definitely could host a hunt on a pond in their after their season closes. And they have all the equipment to keep some of the water open, so you could potentially do an extended season. It's a very interesting concept when you start thinking about possibilities. And I think as encouragement for everybody listening, think about possibilities and not constraints. And I think we can solve a lot of problems if we try to find commonalities through what could be possible rather than what can happen.
And all it takes is people having those discussions. So again, with the people that help make those decisions. And that's, you and I, I'm sure we both see on social media, you sitting having a couple of beverages and everyone's talking, and they're talking to their friends, but they're not talking to the people that may necessarily know the answers or the ones that can help make those decisions. So I do recommend that you all reach out.
Gets spread too, because you have people that are, talking about, hey, well, I heard this. And then the next person they tell it's not the same. and
Right.
a good old game of telephone. And by the time, what the saying is the truth doesn't put on its pants before the lies halfway around the world.
Right.
I mean, it's true. So it's very important that we have these discussions, I think, as we go forward, because I think we do face a lot of management challenges as we develop the countryside and our communities expand, and we want these beautiful places with retention ponds and small little forested areas that will hold wildlife. I mean, hell, there's so many issues we could go down. You got coyotes living in the city killing small dogs. I mean, all of these things that need to happen from a management perspective that involve all of us coming up with creative and innovative solutions. And I think more people that share their opinion and we can get other people's ideas and talking about solutions on the table is really how we all drive innovation through this and grow together as communities.
Totally agree.
Well, I'm going to give you the microphone if there is anything left that you want to wrap up, but I am kind of through my list if you want to wrap things up today, because we've been at this quite a long time, and I appreciate you giving me this much time today, Taylor.
Yeah, I appreciate you reaching out and having this discussion. And again, I'd be more than willing to participate in future podcasts and talking whatever topics that you think your audience would like to talk about. But like we have said throughout the entire thing, Wisconsin is unique in that we really do base a lot of our seasons and a lot of our policy based on the feedback that we get directly from hunters. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is that everyone does reach out to somebody within the department, somebody within wherever you think that the best bang for your buck's going to be, to provide that feedback and information. Because, for example, before we started trying to utilize technology, we were setting our hunting seasons for migratory birds for 80,000 waterfowl hunters and dove and duck and woodcock hunters based on about 150 comments. So now we're approaching 3,000. But when you still think about that, there's a lot of people out there that are doing this each year that have thoughts, that have, suggestions.
You're basing policy based on 5% of the population that's using the resource, sharing their opinion with you.
And it's the best we can do right now until we hear from the people that do reach out and provide that. So I can't emphasize how important that is.
I think it's super important that you shared those statistics with us, because hopefully that encourages somebody to reach out, share, and it just drives more information and better policy and better engagement and exactly what you guys are looking for.
Other than that, thanks again for having me.
Well, I think just to put the seed out there, and since we've asked for a little bit of engagement today and close things out, if somebody's listened this long to the podcast, feel free to email me. I will include Taylor's contact information and email in the show notes as well. If there is a specific topic in Wisconsin related to migratory birds that you want to hear about, I'd be happy to have Taylor back on the show. Feel free to email me or Taylor, and we could definitely talk about putting a show together. I personally think I would love to talk to you, maybe not this long, but I don't know if the topic could go that long, maybe. But I'd like to, hear a little bit more about Wisconsin dove hunting, to be honest with you. It's something I've considered doing early in the season to kick things off, and I've never done it. And I hear it's a hoot, and I know some guys who do it down south where I know it's substantially probably better, but at the same token, I would like to highlight the opportunities you guys have in Wisconsin and put some effort in, I know, down in the southern part of the state. So yeah, that's one thing we could definitely talk about. But regardless, Taylor, thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll definitely be in touch here.
Thanks, Brian. You have a good rest of the day.
You too. Yeehaw! I think we're playing the best bumper music in podcasting. No, all seriously, we're not playing any good music, let us know. But I think we're playing some damn good music, and we'd love to hear from you. Brian@amazon.com. If you've made it this long, you must be a loyal listener. Thank you so much for taking your time today to listen to episode 43 of the Amazing Outdoors podcast. Please consider joining Patreon. It's only $5. What do you get these days for $5? You can get a cool hat, man. If you join in March, I'll send you out a hat, especially if you're one of the first 10. Plus, you get one entry to June's drawing for a pair of Uplnd Outfitter pants. They're nice bird hunting pants. They're worth like $180. Again, a hat is going to go out to the first 10 patrons who support this program. Help us grow our Patreon page. My Patreon page is patreon.com/amazingoutdoors. There's a link in the show notes. If you're going to head there right now, check out Patriots for Praise also. I ended up going to a Rough Grouse Society banquet last night. I joined a new chapter. Had a great time. Thanks, Jeff. Get out there. Join a local habitat organization and make a difference for our futures. I encourage you to take someone new outdoors on your next adventure. Most of all, God bless you. God bless America. Straight shooting, tight lines. Get out there. This is Brian Mays, and I'm out.